Guess what? Spoiler warning, hot damn. I'm going to talk about a segment somewhere in the middle of Observer, and if you're interested in this game, you kind of want to go in blind, so hey, there you go, that's your warning. Boom. Observer's a game that has a lot in common with its older sibling, Layers of Fear, which is also made by the team at Bloober, so it kind of makes sense. They're both fairly on-rails horror fests filled with audio logs with a flair for jump scares. Peppered with societal commentary and some symbolism, Observer's different in that it takes place in a Blade Runner-style cyberpunk future, and instead of just looking around the environment, you get two types of detective vision to help you solve future crimes by looking around the environment. The main character, Daniel Lazarski, is your typical old cop with nothing to lose, but also this old cop with nothing to lose can hack into people's memories or something like that to try and piece together bits of information to solve crimes. It's pretty soft science, but there's some cool sequences thanks to the idea, and without this, the whole game kind of falls apart, so I'm gonna let it slide. Observer's website posits this concept with some pretty heavy questions. What if your fears could be hacked? What if your thoughts could be used against you in a court of law? It paints this image of a game world that brings up ideas of thought crime actually being a thing. A world that's Orwellian in nature with a hard-cast class system that fucks over its inhabitants if they don't have enough money. In some ways, Observer delivers on these ideas, but for the most part, thought crime is pushed to the side in favor of presentation, spooks, and stories that focus more on the individual characters you hack into than they do with the world at large. The stories are more personal, and instead of asking the player to think about how scary memory hacking is, it asks the player to think instead about this shitty world and what it's done to the people in it. Everyone's kind of a victim of circumstance in Observer, a victim of their upbringing or shitty choices, and the focus is on how people came to be in their shitty situations as a consequence of what the world's become. Thanks to the more personal focus that the devs decided to take in Observer, we're able to get some pretty great moments and pretty awesome stories. While a lot of what Observer does is very firmly in the horror game column of design, what with jump scares being the name of the game, and with a bunch of weak-ass hide from the monster segments scattered throughout, there are some pretty great moments of psychological horror, and in one instance, a section that brings humanity to a monster that has been chasing the player almost the entire game. Before we talk about the big reveal that is the Wolfman's fucked up psyche, I need to praise how well he's established as a villain. A lot of horror games, especially those with monsters that you have to hide from, kinda just drop you in with whatever monster sans any establishment or build-up. Hell, Observer itself is guilty of this within a few of its own segments, but it handles the Wolfman exceptionally well. The entire first couple hours of Observer is just build-up to the face-to-face reveal of the Wolfman, where you finally get to dive into his mind and start piecing more of the mystery together. You find a corpse missing a head and it's cut all over as if by beast's claws. You meet a blind man who describes angry, deliberate footsteps like something that's hunting. And if you listen enough when you're exploring, you'll even hear growling and guttural noises in the environment. This foreshadowing just builds up and goes on. Eventually, you dive into your first mind. You find a guy on his apartment floor and he's not in really good shape. Detective visioning the area around him, you'll find erratic cuts, some blood, and some hair that isn't from a human or any known animal. You dive into his head, go through the linear spook sequence that kind of gives you insight into this character, and it does its job. It's pretty cool element, but moving on. And you catch a glimpse of something jumping at him at the very end. Then the dude dies while you're in his head and you get kicked out. And this build in intensity goes on as you discover another dead body shortly after this first dive. There are similar signs of a struggle, same weird hair found, a bunch of claw marks, and similarly, during the dive, towards the end, you catch a glimpse of the Wolfman before getting booted out. Explore a little further and there's a sequence where you're on the run from it very briefly. You're trying to find your way out of a maze-like basement while the fucking Wolfman is tracking you down. It feels like a game of cat and mouse, where you're the mouse. You wander around, find another dead body, examine it, and start really piecing a few details together. Number one, whatever this thing is that's killing people, it's doing it because they have some kind of connection. And two, it's mad, it's fast, and most importantly, it's hurt. You find some blood and you follow the trail as you try to hunt it down to figure out what the hell's going on. Then, at long last, you're face to face with the bastard that's been killing your leads and very likely killed your son. He pounces you down a hole from behind and gets caught up in electrical wires and he fries to death. And you finally get a chance to hack into his mind and figure out what the hell's going on. So now that you're actually in this creature's mind, we can talk about what makes this short 10 to 15 minute section of an hours long game the best thing about it. You know the context of this dive thanks to the build-up, and when you finally get to this point in-game, it is satisfying to have some kind of explanation so very, very close. You're expecting nothing but a beast, a monster conjured up in a lab by some twisted psychopathic scientist, bred to keep people silent or just for the sake of carnage. What you get is something so much better. Before exploring any of the recent events, you go through bits of the Wolfman's childhood. You learn that he was born deformed, he was rejected and verbally abused by his father, the neighboring tenants of the apartment complex, and of course kids his age. The young Wolfman found himself identifying with werewolves and wolf people in fiction. After hearing the story of Little Red Riding Hood, he asks his mother why the wolf had to die. You learn that this child, likely in an effort to make himself closer to the Wolfman he idolized, began making grotesque masks in secret. Towards the end of the sequence, as he grows older, you see through his eyes as a grown man, getting cybernetic implants and genetic modifications. As he goes mad, he turns himself into what he idolizes. And finally, he's at some kind of peace with himself, and he knows who he is. There's a bit more detail and kind of behind the scenes to what's going on here, why he goes around killing these people and stuff like that, but I don't want to get into it because it's a pretty major spoiler that is revealed later outside of the sequence, so we're just gonna move on from that. The last few minutes of this segment are they're fucking awesome. Remember earlier when I described you as a cop playing cat and mouse with this creature that was stalking you? You essentially play through that from the Wolfman's perspective. You see that he wasn't so much stalking you as he was hiding from you and observing you. You witness yourself discovering the secret rooms of the tattoo shop. As the Wolfman, you both stalk Daniel and hide from him as he wanders the basement, and then you pounce him down the hole and get fried by electricity. Within the context of the game's story, it gives you insight into this character that you've been chasing since you arrived at the apartment complex. You learn not just why this guy is how he is, but how he became this beast, this Wolfman. You see that it's not just some bloodthirsty experiment that escaped from a lab, but a human being that was pushed to this by circumstance, by years and years of abuse and rejection and living in a shitty world that didn't care. And you realize that, really, at any moment, he could have ripped you to shreds. On a broader scale, it's a rad sequence because it makes commentary that a lot of Observer just kinda skips past. We see what it's like, at least in part, for a kid in pretty terrible circumstances growing up in a pretty terrible place in a pretty terrible world like Observer's. It turns this monster used to drive the game forward into a commentary on not just society, but psychological abuse, body image issues, and even drug abuse. By making this Wolfman human, by giving him a name and a past and demonstrating for us the essence of everything he's suffered through, it gives the world more depth than almost anything else Observer or any other horror game has really done with its monsters. Observer promises a lot, but it only delivers on a few things. It's so focused on outright scaring you that it seems to forget its strengths are really in subtle story beats, psychological and suspenseful horror, screwing with the player, not segments that have you hiding from monsters like every other horror game since Amnesia. Its strongest moments are those like the Wolfman reveal and mind sequence, events that get you to question the world you're exploring and how it affects the people who reside in it. It's a shame that so much time is spent instead on a main plot that's just not as impressive. I would love a game set in Observer's universe that plays more into these questions of society's impact on the individuals living in it. But what we have is pretty good enough for a playthrough and at least a few thoughts. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please remember to do the YouTube stuff, follow me on Twitter, share the video around, and most importantly, comment down below to tell me what you think about this sequence and if you know of any sequences like it in other games. I'll see you next time. Bye!